Welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is becoming the enemy. Um, there's a lot to unpack in that statement, just the notion of enemy to begin with. But what we're really talking about is how by fighting something, we often become the thing we were fighting, or another version of it. And so we get to look into that. It should be really an interesting conversation. Good morning, Rosalind. Welcome. So good to have you joining us this morning. And welcome to everybody else who's with us. Before we get started, let's take a couple minutes to get present. So let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, creating wow, I lost my cadence there. That's so interesting. So let's try one more time. We'll take a deep breath in and imagine that. I guess I'm not speaking, I'm not going to be doing the centering thing this morning. Oh, how interesting. All right, we'll just get started. um, it's interesting when you have a routine and that routine gets disrupted, right? And there's a disorientation around that, and it's sort of creating something fresh. Very interesting. Anyway, becoming the enemy. The idea here is that when we fight something, we oftentimes are become deeply immersed in the fight, and then if we're fighting an oppressor, what often happens is that whoever has then vanquished the oppressor becomes the new oppressor in one way or another. And we can sort of see, and it's not just oppressor, but whoever's running the show. We can see how uh, in our country, the Republicans, the Democrats, it's just like who's running the show now kind of shift. And what happens is that it's sort of a recursive change, meaning it's just something that is perpetuating dysfunction in many, many, many cases. I think we can see that in our government, where it may be degrees of dysfunction depending on who's in power, but it's all emerging kind of from the same model. This is the problem with problem solving, is that it is stuck in kind of a self-contained system. It, like, the problem is defined by the past. It's not, and the solutions that we're creating are generated from within the same sort of container, the same sort of paradigm that from which the problem emerged. And so this notion of becoming the enemy, becoming the thing that we were fighting, um, can happen, and we see it happening over and over in all kinds of social structures. So when there are prejudices, for example, prejudices breed prejudices in many, many ways. So I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday about a relatively conservative community, and the expressions of the LGBTQ community within that community. And it's very interesting that having been the object of all kinds of discrimination and name calling, the response in this particular community from to the name calling that they were subject to is to be name calling in return. And in other words, both groups are displaying the same kind of behavior toward one another. And it seems that in this particular community, it's reinforcing the factional nature of relations between people there, and it's creating more friction. So at least on the surface it is, so if you're calling me names and then I'm calling you names, how are we transforming, how are we achieving the sense of equality and connection that we're looking to achieve? Which creates it poses a unique challenge to us, I think, to be asking those questions, because it forces us to find higher ground, whoever we are, whatever side we're on. As long as we're making sides, it's kind of a lose-lose proposition. So when we're fighting something, or when we're coming up against something, when I'm trying to look for language that isn't polar, that isn't polarized, that isn't us and them. So when we experience a situation where there is prejudicial behavior, let's say, how do we interact with that in a way that isn't perpetuating that same rift, that same separation? How do we find ways to create bridges, to rehumanize our relationships with each other? I think one of the things that allows us to be so hateful, to be so combative, is a sense of separation, a sense of otherness, a sense of isolation, or a sense of having been victimized. Good morning, Robin. Welcome. Great to have you joining us today. We're talking about how when we're often passionately engaged in a battle, battle can perpetuate battle. And what happens is we become that which we've been fighting against. And what kind of tactics can be employed, and it becomes sort of a strategic fight, but often driven by passions that express the least of us, the least of ourselves, or the worst of ourselves. And I'm wondering how we can create truly transformative change. Robin says tug of war. Exactly. Exactly. It becomes either way, whichever side loses gets dragged through the mud. But the thing is that both sides end up dragging through the mud, because it's kind of like we devolve to the lowest common denominator. And it's like when you're I keep coming with the word fight, so I am asking for your assistance here, maybe to find other words. But oftentimes when we're fighting for something, just the notion that we're fighting is creating an enemy. And so if we're up against somebody who fights dirty, the inclination is to fight dirty, right? Which is kind of like, again, sinking to the lowest common denominator. And I'm reminded of something that I believe it was Buckminster Fuller said, which is, I'm paraphrasing in a big way, don't try to change what doesn't work, create something new that works better. And that's a big challenge, to step outside of the existing thinking and the existing way of being and this fight kind of thing. It does kind of take two people to fight, or two sides to fight. And if there's a way that we can refuse to be the other side of that fight, then things take a different path potentially. Um, I'm thinking about, all of a sudden I'm thinking about Russia and Ukraine, and I don't know the solution. I don't know how this conversation actually applies to that. I mean, if you're being attacked and overtaken and your life is being upended, then what, right? Then how do you respond? Um, you fight back. Rather than being overtaken, or destroyed. So I guess this conversation really has many levels to explore. But the thing that we're really focusing on today is becoming the enemy, like becoming that which we despise. And a reflection of the thing that we're fighting. It's a wild dynamic. It's like anger begets anger, right? Love begets love. And so when we're getting down in the trenches, it happens so often that those who rise to power become the new oppressors. Isabel, welcome. My heavens, it's been a while. Welcome. It's great to have you here with us. So Robin says there will always be black, gray, and white sides. That is what the world is made of. And many colors too, right, Robin? Yeah, so there, I think this is an interesting thing because when we're living in a world of polarity, that's kind of maybe this is a 3D, 5D conversation where how do we move into transformative change rather than or generative transformation rather than recursive change, where we're really just perpetuating the same dysfunction over and over. How do we move into the next level? And so I've talked about this before. There's a framework that is it's a triad where there's an activating force, a restraining force, and those two things are the polarities. Those two things are kind of like the two sides of the coin, but there's a unifying force or a reconciling force that if we can hold those polarities long enough, which is horribly uncomfortable because it seems like they're irreconcilable. If we can hold them long enough, what happens is that we end up jumping to a new dimension, to this reconciling force. It's like the third side of the coin, which is actually the side of the coin. Then that is unifying heads and tails, right? There's this third way, and that's the unifying force. And somebody over this past weekend took it even a bit further, which I thought was so brilliant, was that when you spin the coin, it stops being a flat disc and it starts to have the appearance of a sphere, which is a whole different dimension of reality and awareness. And it is truly a unifying force. So rather than really just flipping the sides of the coin, being heads or tails, which is still of the same thing, two sides of the same thing, a polarity, but that perpetuates that. What if we can jump to this new level that allows us to create something truly generative, where we don't devolve into this other, into the thing that we were fighting. So it's kind of like chocolate and vanilla. They're both ice cream, you know. So Robin says, you are responsible for your actions. Seek the highest and best good for the situation. Be the positive. I love it. And well, so the highest and best good. I love that you said you're responsible for your actions. So one of the things that we were looking at over the weekend in this workshop that we did was a comparison contrast between Western values and indigenous values. And one of the contrasts was, in our culture, we're fighting for our rights. And that was contrasted against in indigenous culture, we take responsibility. And that's a really interesting contrast. Rights on one side, or fighting for rights, demanding rights, versus taking responsibility. And the notion of demanding rights kind of comes into play in this conversation, because what it is very much a function of a dominating power structure where there's a dominating hierarchy, right? And there that dominating force metes out rights to the dominated or the subservient masses below this level of hierarchy. So there's a hierarchy rather than a collective. And so when we take responsibility, then we have a sense of empowerment. Fighting for rights is in its way coming from it is coming from a place of disempowerment, right? It's coming from a place of being sort of this subservient or secondary class, coming from a place of powerlessness in a certain way. And that fight is creating some empowerment, but it's still against, it's like truth to power kind of thing, right? It's saying that power is all powerful, whereas the internal experience of responsibility versus demanding rights, one is kind of there's a different sense of ownership, I think. So if we say it's my responsibility to change this, it's, in a way, it's different than the fighting for it or the demanding the rights, because it's a nuance. It's a nuance. I think you can feel the subtlety of the difference, because in taking responsibility, I will engage to make change, right? But the fight that comes with it, it's kind of like before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water, but it's a very different thing. I don't know if you've heard that expression, but it's the difference kind of between doing and being, where doing still gets done from a space of being, but the thing that is driving that doing is quite radically different. So before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water may feel like a burden. We might be grumbling, we might be resisting it, we might have all kinds of stories about it, we might be doing it robotically. And then after enlightenment, as we're chopping wood and carrying water, we're really present in that process. And so that's kind of the difference between fighting for rights and being responsible. It might look similar from the outside, but the being state that is underlying is radically different. I'm hoping that nuance gets conveyed here. So Isabel says, when we understand that there are as many sides as people, yes, yes, yes. So we all have to take our responsibilities and powers back to live in peace and harmony. Only way to get off manipulation and programming. We have all been living for centuries. Yes, thank you, Isabel. It does require us to take responsibility to be in our power. It's kind of like Gandhi. Gandhi fought the system, right? But it was a very different fight. It was from a space of this is what's right, and it was in a path of peace, right? And to say this is the stand that we take, and the fight was coming from that place of responsibility and ownership and sovereignty, um, rather than a place of victimhood. Like serving a righteousness. I think um, it's a very interesting conversation, but it's important that we stand in that place of responsibility, peace, harmony, and true power rather than force. I guess that's really an important distinction: power rather than force. Anyway, interesting conversation, and I think it's an interesting thing that for us to look at, where in our lives have we become the things that we were fighting against, and how can we elevate ourselves and our expression, so that we can elevate the field altogether. Anyway, thanks for hanging in for this. I really appreciate your input and your collaboration in these conversations. So I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel. And I invite you to please like and follow Enlightened World's YouTube channel and mine. The links are in the description, and I so appreciate you. So until next time, so much love.